You are standing on a crumbling stone terrace, looking out over a sea that has swallowed the ambitions of 1,000 empires. The night air of Constantinople is heavy, thick with the scent of salt water, burning pine, and the damp, metallic sting of oncoming rain. Beneath you, the black waters of the Bosphorus churn in silence, cutting a jagged line between Europe and Asia. If you listen closely, past the rhythmic lap of the tide against the ancient sea walls, you can hear the faint, echoing murmur of a city trying to sleep. But it is a restless sleep. It is the sleep of a golden cage filled with 500,000 souls who know that out there, beyond the massive triple-layered walls of Theodosius, the rest of the world is burning. The year is not a number you need to remember. It is simply the twilight of everything that once was. The great Western Roman Empire, the world of Julius Caesar, of grand marble forums, and of legionaries marching on stone roads from Britain to Syria, has been dead for less than a century. It was torn apart by internal rot and the relentless hammers of migratory tribes. Rome itself, the eternal city, is a ghost town. Goats graze in the ruins of the Roman Forum. Weeds split the floors of the palaces on the Palatine Hill. What remains is here in the east. This is New Rome, a glittering, paranoid fortress metropolis of gold icons, dark conspiracies, and endless red tape. The people here still call themselves Romans, but they speak Greek, pray in massive domed churches, and live under the suffocating shadow of a divine emperor. They are an empire clinging to a memory, terrified that the darkness of the world is finally closing in to snuff them out. You look toward the great palace, a sprawling labyrinth of stone, silk, and whispered betrayals that sits like a massive crown upon the city's highest hill. Inside its deepest, most heavily guarded chambers, a man is sitting awake by the flickering light of a single tallow candle. His name is Justinian. He is the ruler of the civilized world. Yet his eyes are bloodshot, with a manic, sleepless exhaustion. He does not see the room around him. He sees maps. He sees a shattered world that he desperately believes God has ordered him to glue back together. Justinian is not a soldier. He is a bureaucrat, a peasant-born workaholic who climbed to the absolute peak of human power through sheer cold intelligence and ruthless political maneuvering. He is a man consumed by a singular, obsessive ghost, the dream of reconquest. He wants to tear Italy back from the Ostrogoths, rip North Africa away from the Vandals, and wash clean the shame of Rome's fall. But a man cannot conquer the world with ink and decrees. An emperor needs a sword. He needs someone who can look into the jaws of absolute annihilation, outmatched 10-1, and somehow find a way to win. He needs a ghost of his own, a living embodiment of the old Roman martial spirit. You turn your gaze down toward the darker, quieter quarters near the harbor, where the military barracks sit in the shadows. There, sleeping without a guard, is the only man in the world who can make the emperor's mad dream a reality. Flavius Belisarius. He is young, barely 30, with the quiet composure of a man who has already looked at death in the eyes and found it unremarkable. He does not possess the frantic, trembling ambition of his master up in the palace. Belisarius is cut from a different, older stone, in an age characterized by systemic corruption, where generals sell their loyalty to the highest bidder, and politicians switch sides with the wind. Belisarius possesses a quality that is both his greatest weapon and his ultimate tragic flaw: absolute, unshakable loyalty. He believes in the idea of Rome, not the corrupt, scheming reality of the court, but the pure, idealized concept of the Republic, an empire of law, order, and honor. He loves his emperor not out of fear, but out of a deep, almost religious sense of duty. He is a man who will give everything to a master, who will ultimately give him nothing in return. You can feel the invisible web of tension stretching between these two men tonight. It is a psychological trap that will dictate the next 30 years of history. Justinian needs Belisarius. Without him, the emperor is just a lonely man in a big house writing laws that no one outside his walls will obey. But Justinian also terrifies himself with his own dependence. He looks at this young, brilliant, charismatic general, and he does not just see a savior. He sees a rival. He sees a man whom the armies adore. He sees a man who, with a single nod of his head, could turn the spears of the legions toward the palace windows. Paranoia is the occupational hazard of every Roman emperor, and Justinian has it in his bones. Every victory Belisarius wins for the empire will be a nail in his own coffin. Every province he restores to the map will make his master wonder if the general is building a kingdom of his own. It is a dynamic of profound psychological cruelty. Belisarius must be brilliant enough to defeat the enemies of Rome, but he must remain humble enough to let himself be broken by the very man he saved. You hear the wind shift, carrying with it the low, terrifying rumble of a crowd. It is a memory that haunts this city, an event from just a few years prior that forged the bond between emperor and general in letters of blood. The Nika riots. You must understand this moment to understand the dark gravity of their relationship. It started over something as trivial as chariot racing at the Hippodrome, the massive stadium adjacent to the palace, where the blue and green factions clashed like modern political parties, mixed with street gangs. But the anger ran deeper than sports. The people were suffocating under Justinian's heavy taxes raised to fund his grand building projects and his dream of war. The blue and green factions did something they had never done before. They joined forces. The chant went up through the streets, a roar that shook the marble foundations of the city. Nika! Nika! Victory! Victory! For 5 agonizing days, Constantinople burned. The riots transformed into a full-scale revolution. The mob torched the grandest buildings, slaughtered the city guards, and surrounded the palace. They brought out a reluctant nobleman and crowned him emperor in the streets. Inside the palace, Justinian was done. His bags were packed. The ships were waiting at the private harbor below the terrace to carry him away into exile. A failed ruler running into the dark. His counselors urged him to flee, but his wife, the Empress Theodora, a woman born in the gutters, an actress and courtesan who possessed a spine of cold steel, stood up and spoke words that halted the panic. She looked at her trembling husband and told him that if he wished to fly, the sea was ready, but that she would stay. She told him that royal purple makes a fine burial shroud. Justinian stayed, but he did not fight. He turned to Belisarius, who stood in the shadows of the council chamber, waiting. The young general took his small, elite force of barbarian mercenaries, men who owed their personal allegiance to him, not to the state, and he marched out into the smoking ruins. He did not hesitate. He did not debate the morality of what he was about to do. His emperor had commanded him to save the city, and so he would save it, regardless of the cost to his soul. Belisarius led his men through the charred streets and sealed the entrances to the Hippodrome, where 30,000 rioters were packed inside, celebrating their perceived victory. You can almost smell the copper tang of the massacre that followed. Belisarius gave the order. His veterans drew their swords and moved into the packed stands, like harvesters cutting down wheat. There was no room for combat, only slaughter. The screams of 30,000 citizens echoed out over the Bosphorus as the sand of the racetrack turned into a thick red mire. By nightfall, the riots were over. The throne was safe. Justinian sat on his seat of gold, his hands clean, looking down at a city of silence. But as he looked down, his eyes inevitably fell upon Belisarius. Covered in the blood of the emperor's own subjects, Justinian knew, with a sudden, chilling clarity, that the man who had just saved his life was the only man in the world who could take it. The silence that settled over Constantinople after the Nika riots was not peace. It was the quiet of a graveyard. It is the same heavy, suffocating silence that surrounds you right now on this terrace. The slaughter at the hippodrome broke the spirit of the citizens, but it cemented the secret, unbroken contract between the ruler and the soldier. Justinian had discovered that his general was an instrument of terrifying efficiency. Now, with the domestic opposition crushed and buried in mass graves beneath the city outskirts, the emperor could finally turn his eyes outward toward the lost territories of the West. The grand strategy could begin. But as you look out into the dark horizon, toward the west, where the shadows are deepest, you can feel the immense weight of what is being asked of this young general. He is being handed an impossible task. The imperial treasury is strained. The army is small and composed mostly of untrustworthy mercenaries. And the enemies he must face are entrenched in lands they have held for generations. Yet Belisarius does not complain. He does not ask for more men or more gold. He prepares his ships. He studies his maps. He accepts his duty with a quiet, melancholic grace that marks him as a tragic figure from the very start. He is a man who keys his soul to a higher frequency than the world around him can understand. The night is deepening now. The candle in Justinian's window has finally flickered out, leaving the palace a dark silhouette against the starless sky. The city has grown cold. The slow burn tragedy of Belisarius is about to leave the safety of these walls and spill out across the Mediterranean. From the sun-baked sands of Carthage to the besieged walls of Rome itself, it will be a story of unbelievable military genius, of battles won through trickery, psychological warfare, and sheer force of will. But beneath every victory, like a low, vibrating hum, there will be the constant, creeping shadow of betrayal. You can feel the heavy air beginning to move. The storm is finally breaking over the city. Fat drops of rain washing the dust from the ancient stones. It is time to leave the terrace. It is time to step back into the past, to watch the curtains rise on a drama of epic proportions and intimate sorrow. The fleet is in the harbor, their masts swaying gently in the dark, waiting for the dawn signal to sail. They are sailing toward glory, toward ruin, and toward an end that no man, not even the brilliant Belisarius, could possibly foresee. You are standing at the edge of a frozen forest in the high, windswept country of Illyria. The air here does not smell of the Mediterranean's salt or Constantinople's heavy incense. It tastes of sharp frost, wet pine needles, and the raw iron scent of a borderland that has never known true peace. Far below you, the Balkan mountains stretch out like the jagged teeth of a sleeping beast, buried under a thick shroud of winter mist. This is the birthplace of Flavius Belisarius. It is a landscape stripped of luxury, a place where survival is not a given, but a daily negotiation with the elements and the wild tribes that slip through the mountain passes like ghosts. To understand the man who would twice save the Roman world, you must first understand the soil that grew him, a world completely disconnected from the silk-draped rooms and whispered treacheries of the imperial court. In this rugged frontier, you do not learn to speak with elegance. You learn to listen to the silence. As a boy, born at the turn of the 6th century, in the small settlement of Germania, near modern-day Sapareva Banya, Belisarius grew up surrounded by the physical remnants of a dying superpower. The roads here are Roman, built with massive, cracked stone slabs that are slowly being swallowed by weeds and mud. The forts are Roman, but their walls are scarred by fire, repaired hastily with broken tiles and mismatched stones. After successive waves of Hunnic and Gothic raids, the people who live here are tough, practical, and deeply religious, holding a faith that is as unyielding as the granite beneath their feet. They are the human shield of the empire, the buffer zone between the wealth of the East and the chaotic, shifting tides of the barbarian migrations. You can picture the young Belisarius watching the horizon from the timber palisades of his hometown. Here, history was not a collection of stories written in books. It was a living, breathing threat. He would have seen the columns of imperial smoke rising from distant valleys, the columns of refugees carrying their lives on their backs, and the raw, terrifying speed of the barbarian cavalry. The traditional Roman legionary, the heavy infantryman who conquered the Mediterranean with a short sword, a massive shield, and a disciplined formation, was already an anachronism here. In these mountains, a man on foot was a dead man. The future belonged to the horse. It was during these formative years that Belisarius became obsessed with the mechanics of the saddle. He did not merely learn to ride, he studied the horse as an extension of the human body and an instrument of war. He watched how the Huns, the Avars, and the Goths moved across the landscape, fluid, unpredictable, hitting like a thunderstorm and vanishing before the slow, heavy imperial infantry could even form a line. He realized that if Rome was to survive, it could no longer rely on the tactics of the past. It had to adapt. It had to absorb the genius of its enemies. He spent his youth mastering the composite bow, a lethal weapon of horn, wood, and sinew that required immense physical strength to draw but could drive an arrow through iron chainmail from hundreds of yards away. While riding at a full gallop, he was forging himself into something entirely new. The Bucellarius, the armored horse archer, who combined the discipline of the Roman tradition with the devastating mobility of the steppe nomads. You follow the young provincial as he leaves his mountain home behind, his horse's hooves clattering on the highway leading southeast toward the capital. He is a young teenager, possessed of a quiet, burning intelligence that marks him out from the rough soldiers of his village. He is heading to Constantinople to join the excubators, the elite imperial bodyguard. This was the premier finishing school for the military elite of the era, an institution where a young man from the provinces could catch the eye of the powerful. When Belisarius first stepped through the Golden Gate of Constantinople, the sheer scale of the city must have felt like a physical weight against his chest. You can imagine the sensory overload. The towering marble columns, covered in intricate relief carvings, The glittering gold domes of the newly constructed churches, the deafening roar of 100 different languages bouncing off the stone walls of the markets. It was a world of unimaginable wealth, but beneath the gold leaf, it was a meat grinder of human ambition. Here, Belisarius encountered the man whose destiny would be inextricably linked with his own for the rest of his life. Justinian. At the time, Justinian was not yet emperor. He was the power behind the throne, the brilliant, hyper-educated nephew of the reigning Emperor Justin of Mersk, an illiterate old soldier who had also risen from the Illyrian peasantry. Justinian was looking for talent. He was building a network of loyalty, searching for men who were not tied to the old, arrogant senatorial aristocracy of the city. He saw something in Belisarius, a rare combination of absolute tactical brilliance and a clean, uncorrupted sense of honor. Justinian, a man who trusted no one and suspected everyone of plotting against him, found himself strangely comforted by the young officer's quiet demeanor. He promoted him, gave him command of his personal bodyguard, and eventually sent him back to the frontiers, not as a simple soldier, but as a commander charged with securing the empire's borders. You must see the contrast between these two young men as they sat together in the low-lit offices of the palace during those early years. Justinian, small, pale, his hands always stained with ink, his mind a labyrinth of legal codes, theological arguments, and tax structures. Belisarius, tall, broad-shouldered, sun-browned by the mountain wind, his hands calloused from the reins and the bowstring. They were two sides of the same coin, the brain and the muscle, the architect and the builder. They shared a magnificent, terrifying vision, the restoration of the Roman Empire to its ancient borders. But even then, in the very infancy of their partnership, the seeds of their future tragedy were being sown. Justinian looked at Belisarius and saw a magnificent tool, a weapon of perfect utility. He did not see a friend in the cold geometry of Justinian's mind. A tool that becomes too sharp is dangerous to the hand that holds it. In the late 520s, Belisarius was sent to the eastern frontier, where the Roman Empire collided with its ancient, eternal rival, the Sasanian Persian Empire. The border was a jagged line of fortresses cut into the blinding, sun-bleached plains of Mesopotamia. It was here, at a forgotten desert crossroads called Dara, that the world would first realize that a military genius had been born. You can feel the suffocating heat of the Mesopotamian summer as Belisarius stands upon the low, earthen ramparts of Dara. The Persian army is approaching, a massive, glittering host of 40,000 men, including the legendary immortals, the elite heavy cavalry of the great king, armored from head to toe in polished steel plate. Belisarius has barely 20,000 men at his disposal, a chaotic mix of raw Roman recruits, unruly Hunnic mercenaries, and Herulian horsemen. The odds are catastrophic. Every standard military textbook of the time dictated a cautious retreat behind the city stone walls. But Belisarius knew that a siege would eventually starve them out. He chose to fight in the open desert. He did not fight with brute force. He fought with the mind. You can see the genius of his preparation as he orders his men to dig a massive, irregular trench system directly in front of the Roman lines. It was a move that baffled both his own officers and the Persian commanders. The trenches were not designed to act as an impassable wall, but as a labyrinth. a psychological maze that broke the momentum of the terrifying Persian cavalry charges. He deliberately left gaps in the trenches, invitations for the enemy to advance into specific zones where they could be enveloped. When the Persian horns blew and the massive wall of iron and horses surged forward, Belisarius stood calm in the center of his line, watching the dust clouds rise into the white sky. He waited. He let the Persian left wing advance through a gap in the trench, letting them think they had broken the Roman line. Then, at the precise psychological moment when the enemy's formation was extended and vulnerable, he unleashed his hidden reserve, his elite horse archers, the bucellarii he had spent years training. They struck the Persian flank with the speed of a falcon, their composite bows firing with a devastating precision that turned the elite immortals into a panicked mass of bleeding horses and dying men. The victory at Dara sent a shockwave through the ancient world. It was the first time in centuries that a Roman army had decisively defeated a Persian force of such magnitude in a pitched battle. In Constantinople, the people shouted Belisarius's name in the streets. In the palace, Justinian realized that his young protege was no longer just a reliable bodyguard. He was a living legend, a commander who could achieve the impossible. But the taste of victory was quickly soured by the complex, darker realities of Belisarius's personal life. Around this time, he met and married a woman who would become both his greatest passionate obsession and the source of his profoundest humiliations. Antonina, she was an older woman, a widow with a scandalous past, an actress from the same theatrical circles that had produced the Empress Theodora. Antonina was brilliant, fiercely intelligent, politically astute, and completely ruthless. She was also a close confidant of the Empress, meaning that her marriage to Belisarius was not merely a romantic union, but a political alliance engineered by the court to keep a leash on the young general. You can imagine the quiet torment of Belisarius's inner life as he moved between the brutal simplicity of the military camp and the suffocating, scented air of his marital chambers. He loved Antonina with a blind, desperate devotion that left him entirely vulnerable to her manipulations. She accompanied him on his campaigns, managed his logistics, and acted as his political eyes and ears. But she was also a woman of unchecked passions, and it would not be long before rumors of her infidelity began to circulate among the soldiers, whispered behind tents and over campfires. Belisarius, who could see through any military deception on the battlefield, remained tragically blind to the betrayals in his own bed. He was a man who required absolute loyalty from his world, yet he was surrounded by people who viewed loyalty as a luxury they could not afford. The rain that began to fall at the end of the previous chapter has now turned into a steady, rhythmic downpour, drumming against the canvas of the general's military tent. He is no longer the young boy from the Illyrian mountains. He is a seasoned commander, bearing the weight of an empire's expectations. The victory at Dara and his brutal suppression of the Nika riots have made him the indispensable man of New Rome. Justinian's grand plan is finally ready to be unveiled. The emperor calls Belisarius back to the palace, not to honor him, but to hand him his next impossible assignment. He is to cross the Mediterranean with a pitifully small fleet and invade North Africa, the wealthy, fertile heartland of the old Western Empire, which has been held for a century by the fierce and terrifying Vandals. It is a mission that many in the Senate consider a suicide run, a fool's errand that will drain the last resources of the state. But as you watch Belisarius prepare his men in the harbors of Constantinople, you see no hesitation in his eyes. He looks out over the gray waters of the sea, his mind already calculating the distances, the food supplies, the water rations, and the psychology of the Vandal king. He knows that he is sailing away from the only security he has ever known, entering a vast, unpredictable wilderness where help cannot reach him. He is the tip of the Roman spear, thrust into the dark by a master who watches from a safe distance, waiting to see if the weapon will strike true or shatter against the shield of the barbarian world. You are standing on the wooden deck of a Roman troop transport, its timbers groaning in rhythm with the endless, rolling swells of the Mediterranean Sea. The air is thick with the brine of the open ocean, the sharp scent of pitch used to seal the hull, and the stale, crowded odor of 500 horses stowed in the dark bellies of the ships beneath your feet. Around you, stretching across the horizon like a flock of great white birds, are 500 transports and 90 warships. This is Justinian's armada, a desperate, high-stakes gamble launched into the vast blue unknown. At the center of this floating wooden city sits Flavius Belisarius. He is looking westward, toward the sun-drenched coast of North Africa, fully aware that he has been given an army too small to succeed, a fleet too fragile to survive a storm, and a mandate that leaves no room for anything less than a miracle. The year is 533. To the aristocratic senators in Constantinople, this expedition is madness. A generation earlier, a massive Roman fleet sent to reclaim Carthage from the Vandals had been completely destroyed, its ships transformed into floating funeral pyres by barbarian fire ships, nearly bankrupting the empire in a single afternoon. Now, Justinian has sent Belisarius with a pitifully small force of just 15,000 men. The Vandals are legendary, the fierce Germanic tribe that had swept through Gaul and Spain, crossed the Straits of Gibraltar, and systematically looted Rome itself, leaving its grand palaces stripped of their bronze roofs and treasures. They are masters of the sea and rulers of a fertile, wealthy kingdom that has forgotten what it means to lose. To throw 15,000 men against such an empire is not standard military strategy. It is a sacrifice. You observe the young general as he walks among his men during the long, suffocating weeks at sea. The troops are terrified. Halfway through the voyage, a wave of dysentery sweeps through the fleet because an imperial bureaucrat in Constantinople, intent on cutting costs, had improperly baked the army's hardtack bread, leaving it a green, moldy mass of rot inside the barrels. 500 soldiers die before they ever see an enemy. The men are on the verge of mutiny, cursing the emperor and the general who dragged them into this wet grave. This is where Belisarius's true genius reveals itself. He does not rule through fear or the lash. He rules through a calm, magnetic presence that makes every soldier feel as though their commander is sharing their specific suffering. He gives up his own fresh rations to the sick. He sits on the deck with the ordinary infantrymen, listening to their complaints in his quiet, low Illyrian accent. He establishes a discipline that is almost religious in its severity, yet entirely rational. He issues a strict decree. When they land on African soil, not a single civilian is to be harmed, not a single field looted not a single chicken stolen without payment. He tells his men, "The Africans are not our enemies. They are Roman citizens who have been enslaved by barbarians for 100 years. We are not here to conquer them. We are here to liberate them. If you steal from them, you are no longer soldiers of Rome. You are just thieves in uniform." You can feel the sudden shift in gravity as the fleet finally drops anchor off the shores of Caput Vada, a lonely stretch of sand about 130 miles south of Carthage. The landing is a frantic, exhausting scramble. Men plunge into the surf, dragging terrified horses through the white foam while lookouts scan the dunes for the first sign of Vandal cavalry. But the horizon remains empty. The Vandal king, Gelimer, is completely blind to the danger. He has sent his brother and the elite of his fleet to suppress a revolt in Sardinia, leaving his homeland completely exposed. As the Roman army begins its long march north toward Carthage along the ancient coastal highway, you see the immediate fruit of Belisarius's discipline. The local African farmers, expecting the usual horrific brutality of an invading army, are stunned to find Roman soldiers waiting patiently in line to buy bread and water with gleaming copper coins. Instead of burning villages, the locals open their gates. They provide intelligence, maps, and fresh food. The advance becomes a triumphal procession, but Belisarius remains vigilant. He knows that Gelimer is scrambling his forces, pulling together a massive army to crush the Roman vanguard at a natural choke point just 10 miles south of Carthage, a valley known as Ad Decimum. You can feel the suffocating, dusty heat of that September afternoon as the road narrows into a deep, rocky defile surrounded by steep hills covered in dry brush. Gelimer's plan is complex and lethal. A three-pronged ambush designed to trap the Roman column in the valley, hitting them simultaneously from the front, the flank, and the rear. It is a plan that should work perfectly, but it relies on a luxury that war rarely grants: perfect timing. The Vandal left wing, led by Gelimer's younger brother Amatas, arrives at the choke point too early, before the rest of the trap is set. They collide head-on with the Roman vanguard. Amatas fights like a demon, but he is cut down in the dirt, his throat pierced by a Roman lance. His men panic and flee, trampling their own reinforcements coming up the road. Meanwhile, the Vandal flank attack is intercepted in the hills by Belisarius's Hunnic horse archers, who unleash a storm of arrows that breaks the barbarian momentum before they can even see the main Roman line. But the battle is far from won. Gelimer himself, leading the massive rearguard, moves over the hills and catches Belisarius's main body by surprise. The Roman ranks break. The mercenaries begin to retreat. For a brief, terrifying hour, the entire expedition hangs by a single, fraying thread. If Gelimer presses his advantage, the Roman army will be driven into the sea and slaughtered. Then, history turns on a psychological dime. Gelimer rides down into the valley and finds the bloody, mutilated corpse of his brother Amatus lying in the dust. The Vandal king is shattered. Instead of giving the order to charge the retreating Romans, he drops his sword, throws himself from his horse, and begins to weep over his brother's body, demanding that a proper funeral pyre be built right there on the battlefield. You see Belisarius capitalize on this moment with the cold, predatory instinct of a natural predator. He hears of the king's paralysis from his scouts. He doesn't hesitate. He personally rallies his retreating horsemen, reforms his lines, and launches a massive, unified cavalry charge directly into the stationary, grieving Vandal army. The shock is total. The Vandals, leaderless and frozen by their king's sorrow, break and scatter into the desert. The road to Carthage is open. The next morning, you're walking with Belisarius through the grand gates of Carthage. The city is a marvel of white marble, blue sea, and towering palm trees. The citizens are leaning out of their windows, throwing flowers and chanting old Latin praises that haven't been heard in a century. There is no slaughter, no rape, no plundering. Belisarius marches directly to the royal palace of the Vandals, sits upon the throne of Gelimer, and eats the grand feast that the Vandal king had ordered for himself just 24 hours prior. It is a stunning, unbelievable achievement. In a single battle, with a handful of men, he has reclaimed the crown jewel of the Western Mediterranean for his emperor. But back in Constantinople, the news of this miraculous victory does not bring joy. It brings an icy wave of paranoia. You can imagine Justinian sitting in his dark study, reading the dispatch from Carthage. The emperor's mind does not focus on the restoration of Rome. It focuses on the popularity of his general. The streets of the capital are singing Belisarius's name. The senators are whispering that perhaps this young, brilliant commander would make a far better emperor than a low-born, tax-collecting bureaucrat who stays hidden in his palace. Justinian acts with immediate, passive-aggressive cruelty. He refuses to send reinforcements. Instead, he sends a letter to Belisarius, offering him a choice that is actually a trap. He can either return to Constantinople immediately to receive a triumph, or he can stay in Africa as governor. It is a test of loyalty. If Belisarius stays, it means he wishes to build his own independent kingdom in Africa. If he returns, he leaves his army behind. Belisarius sees the blade hidden in his master's words. He chooses honor over ambition. He packs his bags, turns the governance of Africa over to an imperial official, and sails back to Constantinople, bringing with him the captured Vandal king Gelimer and the immense treasures of the Vandal palace, including the sacred golden vessels that the Romans had lost decades ago. You are present in the hippodrome when Belisarius receives his triumph, the first grand military triumph granted to a private citizen since the days of Augustus Caesar, over 500 years before. The stadium is packed with 80,000 roaring citizens. Golden chariots flash in the sun. Long lines of tall, blonde Vandal captives walk in chains. Belisarius himself rides in a magnificent chariot, his face calm, almost detached from the madness around him. The procession stops before the imperial box, where Justinian sits high above the crowd, glittering in jewels and purple silk like a distant god. The Vandal king Gelimer is brought forward. He looks up at the emperor, then looks down at the golden treasures in the dirt, and shakes his head, muttering the words of Ecclesiastes, "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity." Then Gelimer is forced to prostrate himself, kissing the foot of Justinian. Then comes the moment that everyone in the stadium is waiting for. Belisarius steps down from his chariot. He does not draw his sword. He does not address the crowd. He walks slowly to the center of the track, directly beneath his master's cold, staring eyes. He bows his head, kneels in the dust, and stretches himself flat upon the ground, kissing the shoes of the emperor who suspects him of treason. It is a moment of profound psychological submission. Belisarius is telling Justinian and the entire world that he is not a rival for the throne. He is merely a servant. The applause of the crowd is deafening. a wall of sound that echoes off the stone arches of the stadium. But as you watch Belisarius rise from the dirt, brushing the gray dust from his fine armor, you can see the profound weariness in his eyes. He has proved his loyalty, but he has not cured his master's paranoia. He has only fed it. The triumph is barely over before Justinian hands him his next, even more terrifying assignment. The emperor wants Italy. He wants Rome itself. The Ostrogoths, who have ruled the Italian peninsula for 50 years, are fractured by internal successions. It is the perfect moment to strike. But once again, the forces granted to Belisarius are laughably inadequate. Just over 7,000 men to conquer an entire peninsula, defended by 100,000 fierce Gothic warriors. The rain has stopped now, replaced by a cold, biting wind that whistles through the marble columns of the hippodrome. The general turns away from the cheering crowds and walks back toward the harbor. He is sailing toward Italy, toward a long, grueling war that will last for years, a war that will test his genius to its absolute breaking point and reduce the eternal city to a scarred, starving ruin. He knows the risks, he knows the odds, but as he steps onto the deck of his flagship, he looks back one last time at the great city of Constantinople, a lonely soldier caught between the glory of an empire and the madness of its ruler. You are standing inside the cavernous, hollow shell of the mausoleum of Augustus in Rome. The air here is dead, freezing, and heavy with the scent of damp moss, powdered mortar, and the sour, pervasive stench of human starvation. Through a jagged breach in the massive brickwork, a single beam of cold, gray winter moonlight cuts through the darkness, illuminating a city that has become an open grave. Outside these walls, stretching across the desolate, weed-choked plains of the Campania, are 7 massive, fortified camps of the Ostrogothic army, 150,000 barbarian warriors, their campfires burning like a sea of angry red eyes in the night, have encircled the eternal city. Inside, clinging to the ancient stone hills, are just 5,000 men under the command of Flavius Belisarius. The year is 537. You are witnessing the absolute pinnacle of his military genius and the beginning of his ultimate, heartbreaking isolation. To understand the sheer madness of this moment, you must look at the map of Italy through the eyes of a soldier. Belisarius had swept up from Sicily with his tiny force, taking Naples through a brilliant tactical deception where his men crawled through an abandoned aqueduct under the city walls. The Ostrogoths, paralyzed by internal political fractures and terrified of the general's legendary reputation, had evacuated Rome without a fight, retreating north to Ravenna to gather their immense strength. Belisarius had marched into the city through the Asinari Gate, while the Gothic garrison marched out of the northern gate. The Senate wept. The Pope chanted praises, but Belisarius did not celebrate. He looked at the vast, sprawling perimeter of Rome, 12 miles of ancient Aurelian walls, built for an era when legions were numbered in the dozens, not the hundreds. And he knew that he had just marched his men into a massive, stone-walled trap. You watch the general as he moves along the battlements in the dead of night, his eyes scanning the pitch-black horizon. He has not slept more than 2 consecutive hours and months. His uniform is caked with the gray dust of stone fortifications and the dark stains of dried blood. He did not spend his first days in Rome enjoying the luxury of the ancient villas. He spent them working alongside the civilian population, transforming the city into a functional war machine. He deepened the dry moats surrounding the walls. He repaired the crumbling brick towers with whatever materials were at hand. Shattered marble statues of pagan gods, broken columns, and ancient tombstones. Most importantly, he engineered a terrifying tactical innovation at the city gates. He installed the lupus, the wolf, a massive iron-spiked wooden drawbridge system that could be dropped from above onto attacking enemy columns, pinning them to the earth like insects. He also gathered every grain mill in the city and moved them to the Tiber River, anchoring them to boats beneath the Janiculum Hill, so that the river's current would turn the massive stones to grind flour, rendering the Gothic destruction of the land aqueducts useless. He was not just preparing a defense, he was rewriting the laws of siege warfare. You can feel the earth begin to shake as the dawn breaks on the 18th day of the siege. The Ostrogothic king, Vitiges, tired of the slow starvation, orders a general assault. The sight is breathtaking and terrifying. 7 massive wooden siege towers, higher than the Roman walls themselves, are being dragged forward by teams of lumbering oxen. Behind them march tens of thousands of armored swordsmen, carrying scaling ladders and battering rams, shouting a roar of defiance that bounces off the ancient hills. The Roman soldiers on the battlements are frozen with fear. They look at their small piles of arrows. They look at the endless waves of the enemy, and they look back toward the center of the city, wondering if this is the day they die. But you see Belisarius stand completely still at the Salarian gate, his composite bow in his hand, his face a mask of absolute tranquility. He waits. He lets the massive towers creep closer and closer until the hot breath of the oxen can almost be seen in the cold morning air. The officers are screaming for the order to fire, but the general raises his hand, holding them back through the sheer force of his presence. Then, at the precise psychological moment when the enemy is close enough to see the whites of their eyes, Belisarius draws his bowstring to his ear and lets fly a single, silver-tipped arrow. It flies true, piercing the throat of the chief Gothic commander, leading the central tower. The man falls dead in the mud. The Roman battlements erupt in cheers. Belisarius turns to his archers and gives the command that changes the entire nature of the engagement. Aim only for the oxen. It was a move of pure, cold rationality. Within minutes, a storm of Roman arrows rains down, not on the armored men, but on the animals pulling the siege towers. The oxen fall in bleeding heaps, their massive bodies blocking the roads, turning the Goths' grand engineering marvels into useless, stationary wooden prisons that trap their own troops behind them. The grand assault dissolves into a chaotic, bloody slaughter as Belisarius unleashes his horse archers through the gates to harry the flanks of the broken barbarian formations. By nightfall, 12,000 Goths lie dead in the moats of Rome. But as you walk through the dark streets of Rome, weeks after the battle, you realize that tactical victories cannot feed a starving population. The Goths have effectively sealed every road, every harbor, and every mountain pass leading into the city. The grain supplies are gone. The people of Rome are reduced to eating boiled nettles, grass from the ruins, and rats caught in the sewers. A terrible pestilence sweeps through the crowded tenements, its victims dying in dark corners without anyone to bury them. The citizens, who had welcomed Belisarius as a liberator just months before, now look at him with eyes full of hatred. They curse his name in the dark. They send secret messages to the Gothic king, offering to open the gates at night if Vitiges promises to spare their lives. This is the true, crushing weight of Belisarius's isolation. He is fighting to restore an empire for a people who no longer care about empires, under the orders of a master who refuses to send him help. Justinian, sitting safe in Constantinople, watches the siege of Rome, not with anxiety for his general's life, but with a cold calculation. He sends tiny, pathetic reinforcements, a few hundred horsemen here, a small grain ship there, just enough to keep Belisarius from dying, but never enough to let him win decisively. In the distorted funhouse mirror of Justinian's mind, a general who is completely desperate is a general who cannot launch a rebellion. You see the dark internal rot of the Roman command structure manifest in the form of a man named Constantinus, one of Belisarius's subordinate generals. Constantinus is a proud, greedy officer who has amassed a fortune through looting civilian property during the Italian campaign. He looks at Belisarius's strict discipline and his unyielding loyalty to Justinian with an attitude of intense contempt. One evening, inside the general's headquarters at the Pincian Palace, a bitter dispute breaks out over two valuable gold daggers that Constantinus had stolen from a Roman citizen. Belisarius orders him to return them. Constantinus, fueled by wine and a long-brewing resentment, draws his sword and lunges directly at his commander's throat in front of the entire staff. Belisarius steps back, his face unchanging, as his personal bodyguards tackle the mutinous officer to the marble floor. The next morning, Constantinus is executed. It was a necessary act of military justice to preserve the chain of command during a brutal siege. But back in Constantinople, the story is twisted by the snakes of the court into something sinister. They tell Justinian that Belisarius is executing Roman generals without imperial consent, that he is acting like an absolute king in Italy, and that his army obeys his voice alone. The trap is tightening around the general's neck, even as he stands on the walls, bleeding for the state. Then comes the final, grotesque twist of the Italian campaign. The Ostrogoths, broken by a year and 9 months of starvation, disease, and the relentless psychological warfare of Belisarius, finally give up the siege of Rome. They retreat north to their heavily fortified capital of Ravenna, an impregnable fortress city surrounded by deep salt marshes. Belisarius follows them, cornering them like a wounded beast in its den. The Goths realize they cannot defeat this man through military means, so they make him an offer that would tempt any human being who ever lived. They send a secret delegation to Belisarius's tent. They tell him, "We respect you. You are the only Roman who fights with honor. Our king Vitiges is a failure. We will surrender Ravenna to you today. We will lay down our weapons, and we will join our forces to yours under one condition. You must declare yourself the emperor of the Western Roman Empire. We will crown you here today, and together we will drive the bureaucrat Justinian back into the sea." You can feel the immense, suffocating tension inside that tent as Belisarius listens to the barbarian proposal. It is the ultimate crossroads of his life. If he accepts, he fulfills the grandest dream of history, the rebirth of the Western Empire. He ensures his own safety, the safety of his family, and the eternal devotion of his veterans. He knows that Justinian will never trust him anyway. He knows that the court hates him. Every rational argument points toward taking the crown. But Belisarius cannot do it. His soul is anchored to a concept of honor that is more rigid than iron. He looks at the Gothic elders and tells them that he accepts their terms. But he does so through a brilliant, dark deception. He pretends to agree to become their emperor, to gain entry to the impregnable city of Ravenna. The gates are thrown open. The Roman army marches into the Gothic capital without firing a single arrow, securing the keys to the entire kingdom. But the moment the walls are secured, Belisarius turns to the Goths and declares that he is not their king. He is merely the loyal servant of Flavius Justinianus, Emperor of the East. The Goths are stunned, spat upon, and humiliated by this revelation. They realized they had been tricked not by weapons, but by the general's own reputation for honesty. But back in Constantinople, Justinian does not see a brilliant ruse that won a kingdom without bloodshed. He sees a general who was offered the crown of Rome and hesitated long enough to use it as a weapon. The emperor is terrified out of his mind. He sends an immediate, frantic order, recalling Belisarius to the capital, refusing to even allow him to finish settling the administration of the newly conquered province. The moonlight over the ruins of Rome has faded now, replaced by the cold, sickly orange light of a winter dawn. Belisarius stands on the dock at the port of Classis, watching his baggage being loaded onto the ship that will carry him back to the snake pit of Constantinople. He has won Italy. He has conquered the Goths. He has handed his master a restored world on a plate of gold. But as he looks out at the gray, churning waves of the Adriatic Sea, he knows that he is not returning home to a triumph. He is returning to a cold shoulder, an empty treasury, and a master who will never forgive him for being honorable enough to reject a crown. He is a man completely alone in the world he created, sailing back to a city that is waiting to break him for the crime of being too faithful. You are standing inside the grand, echoing expanse of the Hagia Sophia. The air here is freezing, perfectly still, and thick with the suffocating sweetness of cold frankincense and the bitter, oily smell of thousands of copper lamps burning low in the dark. High above you, suspended like a golden heaven by invisible threads of light, the massive dome hangs over an empty nave. But this is not a house of peace tonight. The year is 542, and Constantinople is not sleeping. It is dying. A silence deeper than any winter frost has settled over the capital of the Roman world. If you listen closely, you can hear a sound that will haunt your dreams. The rhythmic, scraping sound of wooden carts being dragged over marble paving stones, loaded to the brim with the stiff, blackened corpses of the citizenry. The bubonic plague has arrived. It is the invisible enemy that no military genius can outmaneuver, and it is about to tear the fragile fabric of Justinian's empire into bloody shreds, dragging Flavius Belisarius down into the deepest, darkest valley of his life. To understand the sudden, apocalyptic horror of this moment, you must look at the streets through the eyes of those who survived. The plague did not care about imperial grand strategy or the restoration of ancient borders. It crept into the city through the harbor town of Pelusium in Egypt, carried by rats on grain ships meant to feed the capital's 500,000 souls. Within weeks, the daily death toll in Constantinople surpassed 10,000. There was no time for funerals. There was no space for graves. The great trenches dug outside the walls were packed with layers of bodies, like salted fish in a barrel, until the earth itself could no longer contain the stench, and the emperor ordered the roofs taken off the massive defensive towers of the city walls to fill them with corpses instead. The economy collapsed. The courts fell silent. The fields across the provinces went unharvested, their wheat rotting in the sun, while wolves moved into abandoned villages. You look toward the private apartments of the great palace, where the silence is absolute. Justinian has been struck down by the pestilence. The ruler of the world is lying on a bed of purple silk, his skin covered in black, oozing buboes, his mind lost in a feverish, screaming coma. The machinery of the state has ground to a sudden, terrifying halt. In this vacuum of power, the Empress Theodora sits alone in the council chamber, her eyes cold as flint, her hands gripping the arms of her throne until her knuckles turn white. She knows that if her husband dies, her own life is forfeit. The old senatorial aristocracy hates her, the populace blames her for the plague, and the army is far away, commanded by generals who might see this as the perfect moment to seize the throne. Far to the east, on the sun-baked plains of Mesopotamia, Belisarius is once again standing in the dirt, fighting a war with ghosts. The Persian king of kings, Khosrow Thefnir, seeing the Roman Empire paralyzed by the plague, has crossed the Euphrates with a massive host, burning cities and dragging tens of thousands of citizens into slavery. Belisarius has been sent to stop him, but he has been given no reinforcements, no gold to pay his remaining troops, and no clear instructions from the capital. He is fighting with an army of shadows, using his legendary reputation alone to trick the Persian king into a cautious retreat. But the real danger is not in front of him, it is behind him, in the form of a secret dispatch carried by a sweating imperial courier into his military camp. You can feel the heavy, paranoid atmosphere of that military tent. As Belisarius and his fellow commander, Bauses, sit by the light of an oil lamp to discuss the terrifying news from Constantinople. The rumor is clear. Justinian is dying, or perhaps already dead. The generals speak with a blunt, soldierly honesty that would be lethal if overheard in the palace. They say that if the emperor dies, they will not accept any ruler chosen by the palace eunuchs or the Empress Theodora without the consent of the army. It was not a plot to overthrow the government. It was a simple statement of practical military reality. But in the ears of a terrified, defensive empress sitting in a dying capital, those words sound like the first drumbeats of a civil war. The vengeance of Theodora is swift and terrifyingly quiet. Weeks later, Justinian miraculously awakens from his coma, his body scarred, but his mind intact, and more paranoid than he has ever been. Theodora presents him with a heavily distorted report of the generals' meeting in the east. She tells him that while he was fighting for his life against the plague, his favorite general was already dividing his crown among the legions. Bauses is summoned to the capital, arrested in the dark, and thrown into a subterranean dungeon beneath the palace, a space so small and dark that he will lose the ability to see or speak coherently by the time he is released years later. For Belisarius, the punishment is more sophisticated in its psychological cruelty. He is not thrown into a dungeon, he is stripped of his dignity. You see him arrive in Constantinople, expecting to be called to a council of war to save the eastern provinces. Instead, he is met at the gate by imperial guards who strip him of his command. His massive personal retinue, the 7,000 bucellari, who had ridden with him from the sands of Carthage to the walls of Rome, is dissolved, their horses and weapons confiscated and distributed to other officers. His immense wealth, the treasures he had won from the Vandals and the Goths and preserved for the state, is seized by the imperial treasury. He is left as a private citizen, isolated in his own home, forbidden from seeing his friends or holding any office. You watch him during those long, humiliating months of house arrest in Constantinople. The very senators who had thrown flowers at his feet during his triumph now cross the street to avoid his shadow. The citizens who had chanted his name in the hippodrome now whisper that he is a traitor who got what he deserved. Belisarius does not fight back. He does not use his remaining influence to stir up a rebellion among the veterans who still adore him. He accepts his ruin with the same unyielding, melancholic discipline that he brought to the battlefield. He spends his days sitting in his small courtyard, watching the rain fall into the stone basins, a man who gave an empire its identity and was rewarded with total erasure. The psychological torment reaches its climax in a scene recorded by the historian Procopius, a moment of profound emotional degradation that reveals the twisted power dynamics of the imperial court. One evening, an imperial official arrives at Belisarius's house, carrying a letter from the Empress Theodora. Belisarius opens it, his hand steady despite the knowledge that this letter could contain his death warrant. You can imagine the quiet horror of the scene as the general reads the words of the woman who had once been an actress in the gutters. You know what you did to us, Belisarius. You deserve to die. But your wife, Antonina, has been a loyal servant to me. For her sake alone, I have decided to spare your life and restore a portion of your property. From now on, you are not a general of Rome. You are a servant of your wife. Let your safety be a reminder of her mercy. The degradation is total. Belisarius, the man who had tricked kings and shattered the greatest armies of the barbarian world, is forced to prostrate himself before his own wife, thanking her for interceding on his behalf with a corrupt empress. Antonina, whose infidelities had been the talk of the military camps, now holds the keys to his life. He accepts this final humiliation because he has long since decided that his personal pride is irrelevant compared to his duty to the state. He lets himself be broken so that he can remain alive to serve Rome when the inevitable call comes. And the call does come because the empire is burning again. While Justinian was busy dismantling his best general, the situation in Italy has completely dissolved. The Ostrogoths, seeing that Belisarius has been removed, have risen again under a brilliant, charismatic new king named Totila. Totila is a different kind of barbarian. He is young, noble, and deeply intelligent. He has copied Belisarius's own methods, treating the Italian civilian population with immense kindness, while systematically slaughtering the corrupt imperial tax collectors who had swarmed over the peninsula like locusts after the Roman victory. He has recaptured Naples, swept through the south, and is now marching on Rome once more. The Italian conquest, bought with so much Roman blood and starvation, is vanishing like smoke. Justinian realization is bitter. He needs his sword back. He restores Belisarius to his military rank and commands him to return to Italy to stop Totila. But the restoration is an insult. The emperor refuses to return his wealth, refuses to rebuild his elite personal bodyguard of Bucellari, and gives him no money from the treasury to recruit new troops. He is sent back to the scene of his greatest glory with nothing but a handful of raw, undisciplined volunteers recruited from the taverns of Thrace. He is being asked to fight a war against a brilliant enemy with his hands tied behind his back, a sacrificial lamb sent to delay the inevitable. You are present on the deck of the ship as Belisarius arrives back on the Italian coast in 504. The contrast with his first arrival is devastating. The ports are hostile. The fortresses he built are garrisoned by starving Roman soldiers who haven't been paid in years and are ready to desert to the enemy at the first opportunity. Totila has surrounded Rome, and the Eternal City is entering its second, even more horrific siege. Belisarius establishes his base at the port of Portus, just 15 miles down the Tiber River from the city, and begins a desperate, heartbreaking attempt to break through the Gothic blockade to save the starving population inside. You can feel the agonizing tension of his final operational effort. Totila has constructed a massive wooden bridge across the Tiber, blocked with iron chains and guarded by towering wooden forts, designed specifically to prevent Belisarius from floating supplies up the river into Rome. Belisarius constructs a brilliant counter-weapon, a pair of massive cargo vessels joined together, supporting a towering wooden siege tower of his own, containing a boat filled with a lethal mixture of sulfur, pitch, and oil. His plan is to float this infernal machine down the river, slam it into the Gothic bridge, set their forts on fire, and break the blockade in a single, decisive stroke. The execution is flawless. The Roman vessels move silently down the river in the dead of night, guided by the current. They strike the Gothic bridge with a deafening crash. The fire ship erupts into a massive column of orange flame that lights up the surrounding hills, incinerating 200 Gothic warriors in an instant and cracking the wooden timbers of the bridge. The way to Rome is open. Belisarius, watching from a boat behind the vanguard, orders his infantry commander, Isaac, to hold his position at the river base to secure their retreat, while the main force presses into the breach. Isaac, eager for personal glory and wanting to share in the credit for the victory, disobeys his direct orders. The moment Belisarius moves forward, Isaac takes his small cavalry force and launches a foolish, unauthorized attack on a nearby Gothic detachment. He is easily surrounded, his men are slaughtered, and Isaac himself is captured and executed by Totila. When the news of this disaster reaches Belisarius, it hits him with the force of a physical blow. He does not know the scale of Isaac's failure. His scouts tell him only that his rear guard has been destroyed and his base at Portus is under attack. Belisarius believes that everything is lost, that his entire operational base has been compromised, and that his army is about to be cut off and wiped out. For the first time in his legendary career, his composure cracks. He loses his nerve. He gives the order to abort the mission and retreat to the harbor. The fire on the Tiber Bridge burns out in the dark, leaving the wooden beams charred but intact. The blockade remains unbroken. A few weeks later, a starving Roman garrison opens the gates of Rome, and Totila's Goths pour into the Eternal City, plundering what little remains of its ancient wealth. Belisarius sits in his tent at Portus, his head in his hands, listening to the distant, echoing sound of his world falling apart. He has not been defeated by the genius of Totila. He has been defeated by the systematic, cruel neglect of his own government and the undisciplined vanity of his own officers. The ascent is over. The long, slow descent into the gray shadows of history has begun. You are standing inside a silent, salt-rimed watchtower overlooking the desolate mudflats of Ravenna. The air here tastes of stagnant marsh water, rotting reeds, and the cold, stinging damp of the Adriatic Sea. Through the narrow arrow slits of the stone tower, you can see the gray, low-hanging clouds of an Italian autumn rolling inward, swallowing the horizon in an endless expanse of monochromatic fog. There are no trumpets here. There are no cheering crowds. The year is 549, and Flavius Belisarius is preparing to leave Italy for the very last time. He stands alone at the top of the winding stone stairs, his hand resting heavily on the damp brick parapet, looking out at a landscape that has become a monument to his own frustration. He is 44 years old, but his hair is already white as ash, his posture slightly stooped by the unyielding weight of a decade of thankless campaigns. This is the era of the echoes, the twilight years, where the grand architecture of his life begins to dissolve into a dark, melancholy myth. To understand the profound exhaustion of this moment, you must look at what Italy had become after 5 years of grinding, unsupported warfare. This was not the swift, elegant conquest of North Africa. This was a war of starvation, of micro-sieges, of fortresses bought with blood and sold for bread. Totila, the brilliant Gothic king, had turned the entire peninsula into a partisan wilderness. Belisarius had spent half a decade moving his tiny, underfunded force up and down the coast by ship, hitting a Gothic garrison here, relieving a starving Roman outpost there, but never possessing the material weight to hold the land he reclaimed. He had watched Rome change hands, like a worthless token in a gambler's den, captured by Totila, abandoned, reoccupied by Belisarius, who repaired the smashed walls with his own hands, and then besieged once more. The fields of Italy were no longer cultivated. The ancient aqueducts were broken, their waters spilling into the valleys to create treacherous, malaria-ridden swamps. The empire had won a desert and called it a province. You watch the general as he walks down the wooden gangplank of his flagship, stepping into the dark hull where his few remaining possessions are stored. He has finally begged his master for a recall. It was not an act of cowardice. It was an act of brutal, clinical realism. He had written to Justinian, his words preserved by the scratching quill of his secretary. I have arrived in Italy without men, without horses, without weapons, and without money. A man cannot win a war without the instruments of war. My soldiers are deserting to the enemy because they have forgotten the sound of an imperial coin hitting their palms. I ask to be relieved of this phantom command. Justinian, satisfied that Totila had been sufficiently delayed and that Belisarius had been thoroughly neutralized as a political threat, granted the request. The emperor replaced him with Narses, a brilliant, elderly palace eunuch who was 80 years old, fiercely loyal, and crucially, trusted by Justinian with the immense treasury and the grand armies that had been systematically denied to Belisarius for a decade. When Belisarius returned to Constantinople in 549, he did not enter through the Golden Gate. He slipped into the city under the cover of a gray dawn, a private citizen returning to an altered capital. The Empress Theodora was dead, carried away by cancer the previous year, leaving Justinian an isolated, hollowed-out shell of a man who spent his nights wandering the endless marble corridors of his palace, arguing with theologians about the nature of Christ's nature. The palace had grown cold, paranoid, and intensely quiet. Belisarius was granted the title of Comes Sacri Stabuli, Count of the Sacred Stable, a hollow, ceremonial honor that kept him close to the court where he could be watched, but entirely removed from the active command of the legions. He was a monument in a park, a living relic of an era of conquest that the city was trying to forget as the weight of the plague and economic ruin continued to press down on their lives. You follow the aging general through the next 10 years of his forced retirement. He lived in his grand palace near the harbor, a vast, quiet estate where the echoes of his past victories hung in the air like dust motes in an abandoned library. He was surrounded by luxury, his wealth partially restored after the death of Theodora, but his life was defined by a profound domestic isolation. His wife, Antonina, now an old woman, had turned her fierce, volatile intellect toward religion, building monasteries and seeking forgiveness for her scandalous past, leaving Belisarius alone with his thoughts. He spent his days reading the ancient military manuals of Greece and Rome, watching the younger generation of officers march past his windows, men who looked at him with a mix of reverence and historical curiosity, as if he were a ghost who had forgotten to vanish into the earth. But history is a volatile, unpredictable author, and it was not done with Flavius Belisarius yet. You must experience the sudden, heart-stopping terror of the year 559 to understand the final, brilliant flash of his genius. It came from the frozen wastes beyond the Danube, a massive host of the Kutrigur Bulgars, a fierce, migratory horse nomad tribe, descended from the remnants of Attila's Huns, had crossed the frozen river in the dead of winter. They had swept through the unprotected provinces of Thrace like a devastating wildfire, splitting their forces to threaten Greece and Constantinople simultaneously. There was no Roman army in the Balkans. Narses veterans were far away in Italy, and the eastern legions were pinned to the Persian border, the barbarians, numbering over 7,000 horsemen under their Khan, Zabergan, advanced until they reached the small town of Melantius, just 20 miles outside the massive walls of Theodosius. You can feel the absolute, paralyzing panic that gripped Constantinople that spring. The churches were packed with weeping citizens. The silver and gold treasures of the suburban monasteries were dragged inside the walls. The Emperor Justinian sat on his throne, trembling with an old man's fear as the smoke from burning villages could be seen from the palace windows. The city guard was composed of raw, decorative recruits who had never seen a blade drawn in anger. In his desperation, the 77-year-old emperor turned his eyes toward the harbor palace. He sent a delegation to the retired general, begging him to put on his armor one last time to save the city from total annihilation. You see Belisarius accept the command without a single word of reproach for his past mistreatment. He opens his old wooden sea chests, pulling out the iron cuirass that had turned blades at Dara and Rome. It is pitted with rust, heavy, and smells of old leather and sweat. When he rides out through the gate of St. Romanus, he does not lead an army of 7,000 Buxillari. He is followed by a pathetic, ragtag assembly, 300 retired veterans from his old Italian campaigns, men with deep scars, missing fingers, and silver hair, and a chaotic mob of civilian volunteers, shopkeepers, cobblers, and students who had grabbed whatever weapons were left in the city armories. He had no horses, no discipline, and no time. As the small force arrives at the wooded hills of Melantius, Belisarius looks down at the barbarian camp. The Kutrigurs are confident, arrogant, preparing to march on the city gates to plunder the wealth of the East. Belisarius knows that if he fights them in an open engagement, his civilian mob will dissolve in seconds under a storm of nomad arrows. He must fight not with iron, but with theater. He must transform the landscape into a psychological weapon. You watch him coordinate the grand illusion. He splits his civilian volunteers into small groups, hiding them deep within the thick oak forests that line both sides of the narrow valley leading to his position. He gives them a strange, specific order. Every man must cut down a massive oak branch and drag it behind him through the dry dirt and leaves. When the signal is given, he places his 300 iron veterans in a tight, disciplined phalanx across the narrowest point of the road, their long spears locked together like the teeth of a comb. When the Kutragur cavalry surges forward, their horses galloping down the valley, Belisarius gives the sign. Suddenly, the forests on their flanks erupt in a terrifying, deafening roar. The civilians clash their pots, scream ancient Roman battle cries, and drag the heavy branches through the brush, sending up two massive, towering walls of yellow dust that obscure the sky. To the Kutragurs, trapped in the narrow valley, it looks as though two massive Roman legions are moving through the woods to cut off their retreat. At that precise moment, Belisarius's veterans charge forward, their locked shields creating a solid wall of iron, their spears thrusting with a mechanical, veteran precision. The psychological shock is absolute. The barbarians, believing they have been led into a massive, multi-legion ambush planned by the legendary general, lose their nerve. They cannot see through the dust. They can only hear the roar of a phantom army that seems to surround them. They break their formations, turn their horses around, and flee back toward the Danube in a wild, disorganized panic, trampled by their own rear guard. The city of Constantinople is saved in a single morning without a single civilian volunteer ever having to draw a sword. The citizens of Constantinople go wild with joy when the old general rides back through the gates, his armor covered in the dust of the road. They throw green boughs before his horse. They chant his name until the stone vaults of the city shake. But as you watch him look up at the great palace, you can see that the victory has only signed his final condemnation. Justinian did not feel gratitude. He felt a deep, burning humiliation. He, the emperor, had sat shivering in his rooms, while the man he had spent 20 years trying to diminish had stepped out of retirement to perform one final, effortless miracle. The popularity of Belisarius was an insult that the dying emperor could not endure. 3 years later, in 562, the final dark curtain begins to drop. A petty conspiracy is discovered among some low-level officials in the capital to assassinate the aging Justinian. Under the torture of the red-hot iron, one of the conspirators scratches out a name to save his own life, the name of a member of Belisarius's household staff. It was all the excuse the paranoid court required. The general is summoned to the palace council chamber, not as a savior, but as a criminal. You are present in that cold room as the sentence is read out by a shaking palace official. Belisarius stands before the throne of his cousin, his eyes looking directly into the pale, watery eyes of Justinian. He does not offer a defense. He does not beg for mercy. He has spent his entire life demonstrating his loyalty in letters of blood across 3 continents. And if his master cannot see it now, no words will convince him. He is stripped of all his titles. His remaining property is confiscated by the state and he is condemned to house arrest, an old hero left to rot in the dark corners of the city he saved. It is here that the history dissolves into the grand, heartbreaking legend that has echoed through the centuries. While the official court records suggest his property was restored shortly before his death, the collective memory of the Roman people constructed a far more powerful, symbolic truth. They whispered that the paranoid Justinian had ordered the general's eyes to be burned out with a red-hot iron needle. They told of how the blind old hero, dressed in rags, was forced to sit on a cold stone step near the chalk gate of the imperial palace, holding out a wooden bowl to the passers-by, crying out to the soldiers who had once followed him, "Give an obol to Belisarius, the general whom glory raised and whom envy has cast down into the dust." The wind outside the watchtower has grown bitter now, carrying the first icy flakes of a late autumn snow that will blanket the ruins of the Western world. The legend of the blind beggar may be an invention of the centuries, but it represents an emotional reality that no official document can erase. It is the poetic truth of a man who gave everything to a world that was too small, too corrupt, and too terrified to contain his honor. The lamps are burning down to their last drops of oil, casting long twisted shadows across the damp stone floor. Belisarius is no longer a general. He is a lesson in the transient nature of human gratitude. He has reached the end of his active service, his voice reduced to a faint, echoing whisper in the dark corridors of time. The final transition is approaching, the quiet, dark space where the sword is laid down for good and the soldier is finally allowed to sleep, far from the madness of kings. You are standing in the absolute, velvety stillness of a small orchard on the outskirts of Constantinople. The air is perfectly cold, crisp with the sharp, clean scent of damp earth, fallen winter leaves, and the faint, sweet trace of wood smoke drifting from a distant hearth. There is no sound here, the frantic roaring of the hippodrome, the iron clash of swords against shields, the screaming winds of the open Mediterranean, and the suffocating whispers of the imperial court have all faded into a profound, velvety silence. Through the dark, skeletal branches of the ancient fig trees, you can see the distant, pale silhouette of the city walls, their massive stone towers rising like sleeping giants against a star-swept winter sky. It is March of the year 565. The great canvas of history is slowly drawing its final curtain over the life of Flavius Belisarius. The long day's march is done. The campfires are burning down to glowing embers, and the world is inviting you and the old soldier to finally lay down the weight of the sword and step into the safe, warm dark of an eternal rest. To understand the beauty of this final hour, you must let your mind release the heavy armor of the past. Look around you in the dark. The world that Belisarius spent his entire existence trying to hold together is finally letting him go. A few months ago, the Emperor Justinian, perhaps feeling the icy breath of his own approaching death, quietly lifted the house arrest on his old general. There was no grand public apology, no restoration of titles in the Senate, no final triumph in the streets. Paranoia, when it grows old, does not repent. It simply grows tired. The emperor sent a quiet decree returning a fraction of the general's property, this small, secluded estate far from the palace walls, and then turned his back, leaving the soldier to fade into the peace of obscurity. It was the greatest gift Justinian ever gave him, the gift of being completely forgotten. You watch the old general through the low window of his modest villa, He is sitting in a heavy wooden chair beside a wide brick hearth where a fire of olive wood is burning down to a soft, pulsing orange glow. The light cracks gently in the stillness, casting warm, long shadows across the stone floor. Belisarius is not looking at weapons. His iron breastplate, scarred by the lances of the Persians and the heavy broadswords of the Goths, hangs on a simple wooden peg in the corner, its surface covered in a fine layer of gray dust. Next to it sits his composite bow, its string unbent, its horn and sinew finally allowed to relax after decades of unyielding tension. A weapon that is always strung eventually breaks. Belisarius has finally unstrung his life. His hands, which once held the reins of empires and drew lines across the maps of the civilized world, are resting quietly on his knees. They are calloused, lined with deep white scars from ancient arrows, but they are completely relaxed. He is listening to the rhythm of his own breathing, slow, steady, sinking deeper into the quiet with every passing moment. He is no longer thinking about the betrayal of Antonina, the cruelty of Theodora, or the ungrateful madness of Justinian. In the deep, philosophical twilight of a life well fought, those monstrous figures lose their teeth. They become small, fragile actors who played their parts in a play that has already ended. He does not hold anger for them. Anger requires energy, and the old soldier is ready to use his remaining strength for a far more beautiful purpose, the embrace of total tranquility. You feel a soft, rhythmic wave of sleepiness rolling over the landscape, matching the slow, gentle pulse of the dying fire. The script of his life has been written. The ink is dry, and the pages are turning themselves over into the dark. Belisarius closes his eyes, and as he does, the memories of his great battles do not return as terrifying nightmares. They return as beautiful, soft echoes, stripped of their blood and terror. He sees the white sands of North Africa, but there are no charging Vandals, only an endless, warm blue sea stretching out under a golden sun. He hears the wind whistling through the Aurelian walls of Rome, but it no longer carries the screams of starving citizens. It sounds like a gentle, rhythmic lullaby, moving through the pine trees of his childhood home in the Illyrian mountains. He realizes, with a profound, comforting clarity, that he did not fail. The dream of a restored Rome was an illusion, a grand palace built on shifting sand. But his commitment to that dream was real. He had preserved the light of civilization in an age of absolute darkness, not because his masters were worthy of his sacrifice, but because his own soul demanded that he live with honor. He had been the faithful servant of an unfaithful world. He had fought the good fight. He had finished the race. He had kept the faith. Now the watch is over. The reliefs are arriving at the gate. The guards are changing, and he is allowed to step down from the battlements. The fire in the hearth clicks one last time, a tiny spark rising into the black chimney, before the wood settles into a deep, silent bed of gray ash. The room grows cooler, darker, more profoundly peaceful. You can see the old man's chin sink slowly toward his chest, his breathing slowing down, stretching out into long, soft sighs that merge with the cold wind moving through the orchard outside. The shadows on the wall stretch out, reaching up toward the wooden beams of the ceiling, wrapping the room in a warm, protective blanket of darkness. There is no pain here. There is no fear. There is only the safe, slow-burning transition from a world of noise into an eternity of silence. On the 13th day of March, 565, Flavius Belisarius takes his final, gentle breath in the quiet of his home, a few miles away, inside the dark, sprawling rooms of the great palace. Justinian sits awake by his window, a lonely, shivering old man who will follow his general into the grave just a few months later. But Belisarius does not care about the emperor's schedule anymore. He has already broken through the final blockade. He has sailed past the last treacherous harbor, entering a vast, quiet ocean where the ink of bureaucrats cannot reach him and the envy of kings cannot touch his name. You can feel the dark, cool peace of the winter night settling fully over your own eyes now. The story is complete. The long, tragic, yet magnificent journey of the general who saved Rome has found its final, perfect harbor. The white snow is beginning to fall softly outside the window, covering the orchard, the villa, and the ancient stones of the city in a clean, silent shroud of white that washes clean the scars of history. The maps are closed, the swords are cold, the horses are at rest in their stalls, their coats warm in the straw. Let your mind drift down into that same deep, velvety darkness that welcomed the old soldier. The world outside your window is safe. The night is long, and there are no more battles left to fight tonight. Let the echoes of the horses' hooves fade into the background of your consciousness, replaced by the rhythmic, steady silence of a peaceful night. Sleep is the great liberator, the final triumph that waits for every soldier and every traveler at the end of the road. Close your eyes. Let the darkness take you. Step into the quiet. Step into the dark. Safe journey into the final, beautiful slumber.